continuing in our study on Hebrews chapter 1. We're looking at verse 10, and this is going to represent the 12th credential of the spokesman of heaven. And we have Jesus being presented as the architect of heaven and earth. And what he says in verses 10, 11, 12, this actually comes out of the Psalms. He says in verse 10 through 12, this comes from Psalm 102, he says, "You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands." Now, foundations of the earth. This is actually from a word that means substance or foundation, and the idea seems to be that he laid the basis upon which the earth was established. Well, all of creation is established, whatever that may represent. Now, the writer is re-emphasizing here what he said in verse 3. Jesus is the one who is the author of creation. But now he seems to be a bit more specific. He seems to be directing our attention to the fact that this is the active participation of Jesus in the creation event. What is the foundation of the earth? Well, a lot of speculation, but I looked everywhere I could think to look, and it seems that no one has anything to say about this. Are this foundation, are we talking about the creation of the subatomic order that governs the behavior of the elements that serve as the building blocks of everything in the natural world, as we're going to discover later on in chapter 11? Or are we talking about the entire complex of determined relations? You may refer to them as laws of nature, such as physics and physiology, that God put into place to enable the natural processes to function in an orderly fashion. This would seem to be what the Lord is describing when he's talking to Job in Job chapter 38. Or perhaps this is just one more poetic way of saying you created the heavens and the earth. Whatever the case may be, the Son is being presented to us as the active agent of creation. And this overrules all other speculations about causation. It's interesting to me that the scientific community is so consumed with the idea of causation. Did you ever notice that? How did everything begin? Scientists of every field are always searching for the beginning of things by examining statistical regularities in the natural processes, and I find it amusing that billions of dollars are spent in trying to figure out just how everything came into being. All manner of conjectures are put forth to try to create a set of scenarios that seems to fit a collection of theories about how everything came into being. All they have to do is look at the first page of this book and they'll figure that out. And they call us fools. I read an article here a while back from the Apologetics Press. It's written by Eric Lyons, and he makes a very interesting comment. He says, "Atheists contend that Christians cannot possibly know that Christ lived and died and rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. How can you possibly know what happened, what actually happened 2,000 years ago?" On the other side of the coin, they claim to know exactly what happened at the beginning of time, approximately 14 billion years ago. Does anybody see the irony in that with me? But that just shows you the inconsistency of the logic represented by the scientific community. The heavens are the works of your hands. And this is the order of creation recorded for us in Genesis chapter 1. The earth was first created and established, and then the heavens and everything that exists in them was put into motion. Talk about the age of things in the universe, as scientists habitually do. I've never had one put forth the idea that the earth is the oldest object in creation, but it is. And everything else was subsequently formed. Of your hands demonstrates, I think, the active personal participation of the Son in the formation of all matter that exists in the universe. The writer uses the plural word for heavens here. And this would seem to indicate everything that this word implies with respect to the created universe. He isn't talking about the heavens as where God dwells. He isn't talking about the unseen world. He's talking about the formation of creation here. You created the heavens and the earth. I don't think he's talking about the unseen realm of God. But the heavens are the atmospheric, this is the atmospheric shroud that covers the earth. This is the troposphere, it's the stratosphere, the mesosphere, the thermosphere, the exosphere. All of these stages of spheres in the heavens that serve as the shroud over the earth. This is what he's talking about, as well as all of the starry host of the heavens that we can see at night. This is the galaxies and everything that exists in the expanse between the galaxies. This is everything that we can see and everything we can't see in the natural universe. All of it is the workmanship, the artistry, the craftsmanship of the hands of the Son, as he declared through the prophet Isaiah, I have made the earth and created man on it. My hands, stretched out the heavens, and their host, all their hosts I have commanded. Even I, am he who comforts you. Who are you to be, that you should be afraid of man who will die, and the Son of Man who will be made like grass? And you forget the Lord your Maker, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. It is he who sits in the above the circle of the earth, and who inhabits, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretched out the heavens like a curtain, and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. Truly the heavens declare the glory of God, don't they? 13th credential, contrasting the Creator with creation. How in the world do you begin to do that? You compare things that are alike, don't you? Things that are not alike, you contrast. So he's drawing a contrast now between creation and the Creator. They shall perish, but you remain. And they shall become old as a garment, as a vesture. You shall fold them up. They shall be changed, but you are the same, and your years shall not fail. So the temporal and the mutable nature of creation is expressed in fourfold fashion. One, they shall perish, and this is from the word meaning to die or to be utterly destroyed. Their existence is thus limited in time, and their end is subject to the will of the Creator. Now, Peter offers us a rather sobering picture, I think, of the day of the Lord and the subsequent fate of creation in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 13, as he describes precisely how they will perish. He says, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away. The word he uses for pass away is the word that typically means to become vain or to be discarded or disregarded. They shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in them shall be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of person ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. In other words, there is nothing of this created universe that will escape the day of the Lord. Even the very elements, and he's talking about those things which make up matter. Everything will be destroyed at the subatomic level. Everything will melt with fervent heat. They will become old, the Hebrew writer says. They become old as a garment. So time is moving creation toward a conclusion. The universe, with all of its subsequent hosts, is wearing down. Stars die as time begins to take its toll on them. You can see various stages of stars aging and different types of demise. This is the law of entropy, and this is the second law of thermodynamics. Everything in the universe, all matter, is running down. It's wearing out, as described by the prophet Isaiah in chapter 51, verse 6, where he says, "The earth shall wax old like a garment. They that dwell therein shall die in like manner." So what Isaiah is saying is that both man and all of creation dies in the same way. We get old and we wear out, don't we? Some of us are further along those stages than others. The Lord instructs us in Matthew chapter 24, verse 35, that of the certainty of the end of creation. He says, heaven and earth will pass away. And this is the same word that Peter uses in 1 Peter chapter 3. They shall pass away. Now, they shall be folded up. So their demise will not come from the eventual consumption of all energy in the universe, as some evolutionary theorists may surmise. Not all of them hold to this same theory. In fact, as many documentaries as I've listened to over the years, I don't think you can find two scientists that agree on any point, especially with regard to evolutionary theory. But their demise will come not from the eventual consumption of all energy in the universe. Their end will come from an outside source, from outside the natural world. You shall fold them up, and they shall be changed. As a garment, seems to be what he's talking about here. And if your translation says vesture, that's like a garment or a cloak. As a garment that's reached the limits of its usefulness, the heavens will outlive their purpose, and they will no longer, there simply will no longer be a use for them. Perhaps the idea of discarded rather than replaced more aptly complements the idea of being utterly destroyed, as is suggested by "they shall perish." So what all of this tells us about the natural world is that the natural world, all of creation, it is not self-sustaining. What's the second law of thermodynamics? Thermodynamics is simply a study of energy. So the second law of thermodynamics is everything's wearing out and everything's running down. Well, that's absolutely right. In fact, Isaiah even certifies this for us. But it isn't meant to endure forever, and it will eventually reach an end of its intended purpose. Contrary to the first law of thermodynamics, which says that matter is eternal, what does Scripture tell us? Matter, which is energy in repose, energy at rest, all energy, all matter had a beginning. and it will have an end. First law of thermodynamics says that energy or matter can neither be created nor destroyed. What does Scripture tell us? It tells us exactly the opposite. Energy had a beginning. You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth. It will have an end. They will perish and you will roll them up. Now, in contrast to creation, Jesus is immutable. He's eternal. He's external. He stands over and above and outside of time and creation. He is before the beginning of creation. You, in the beginning, laid the foundation. He will be there when creation is brought to an end. When it all ends, you remain. While all creation ages and decays with the passing of time, you are the same. While all things are destroyed, are signed to decay and destruction, your years shall not come to an end. Now, the writer resumes his contrast of Jesus to the angels in verses 13 and 14. And he quotes here from Psalm 110, 1 through 6. Jesus is portrayed as the victorious conqueror. But to which of the angels has he said at any time, sit on my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be heirs of salvation? Now, verse 13 offers a fitting end, I think, to the dialogue of verses 8 through 12, because in verse 8, Jesus is God on the throne of heaven. In verse 9, he is above his companions. In verse 10, he is the governor of the universe. In verse 11, he is the one who will bring an end to all that he has created. In verse 12, he stands over and above all time and matter. Now, in verse 13, Jesus brings an end to all opposition to his authority, all challenges to his authority. And let's look at this from the perspective of the psalmist. Now, understand that to sit at the right hand, to sit is synonymous with rule. If he sits on the throne, guess what? He's the ruler. He's the one with the scepter. So to sit is synonymous with rule, and the place of rule is at the Father's right hand. Who are his enemies over whom he rules? Verse 5 and 6. In verse 5 and 6, they are described as kings and nations and the chief men. In Psalm 2, the drama unfolds of the conflict between the enemies of God and his anointed one. These enemies are the nations and the people and the kings of the earth. They're the rulers, and these assemble themselves together against the Messiah, unwilling to accept his rule. And after having done all that they could possibly do at Calvary to tear their feathers and cast their cords, the roles are now reversed. In verse 4 and in verses 4 through 6, it is now the Son who sits in heaven and laughs at them. The Lord now scoffs at them, and his anger is displayed. He terrifies them in his fury, and despite everything that man could do to free himself from the rule of Messiah, including killing him on a cross, God still says, I have installed my king. What a fruitless bunch of effort on the part of man. Still I have installed my king. And in verse 7 through 12, he declares the preeminence of the Son in that I have begotten you. I will give you your enemy, or give you the nations. The ends of the earth are your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will scatter them. Now the warning is given to the kings and the judges of the earth and the rulers to submit to the sovereignty of Messiah. Notice what he says. Worship Jehovah with reverence. Rejoice and tremble and do homage to the Son. Take refuge in him. And then he offers this ultimatum of repentance. If you refuse, he will become angry. You will perish in the way, and his wrath will soon be kindled. Now, these enemies may well, I think, describe the companions of verse 10, whom the Father has anointed him above. Until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The word for footstool here, the word means to bring under subjection, to reduce someone under one's power. Now, the idea behind this seems to be to conquer the enemy, to place under one's power, control, authority, all of those who oppose him. And the idea of placing one's foot on the head of them or the neck of the enemy was the practice of conquering monarchs after having defeated another king in battle. And you can see this in the example of Joshua. The defeated king would be brought before the conqueror and placed at his feet, and the victor would then place his foot either upon the head or the neck of the conquered king, after which the prisoner would either be slain or he would be remanded as a slave. Now, the symbolism then of our text is that Jesus is the all-sovereign conqueror. All of those who rule in unrighteousness and rebellion, who suppress truth, who oppose righteousness, will ultimately be crushed beneath the feet of our Lord. So how does this contrast to angels? Well, angels have not been exalted above their enemies. Angels have not been appointed to the throne of heaven. Angels have not been invited to sit at my right hand. They've not been granted right hand status. In verse 14, the roles of the angels in redemption is one of ministry and service. They do not actuate, in other words, they're not administrators of justification and sanctification. Their redemption is not their role. They're just active participants. The object of their service is what? Who is the object of their service? We are. The ones who will inherit salvation. So man is the object of their service. So the Father did not leave Christ without help in the flesh, and by the same token, he will not leave his Christians helpless in a hostile world. On at least two separate occasions in the Gospels, if you'll remember, angels came and ministered to Jesus while he was on earth. We may not know exactly how angels minister to us or how they serve the saints. Perhaps it's simply just enough to know that they do, and that God has promised that. It's astonishing, I think, to realize that everything heaven does, it seems to do with you and me in mind. Everything heaven does, it seems to do for the benefit of the church. Just like he said in Ephesians 1, he works all things together for the good of those who love God. And that includes elections that may not turn out the way we hoped. But he works out all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. So everything accomplished in chapter 1 is for our benefit. The glorification of verse 13 is the result of Jesus having overcome. And the same promise to sit at my right hand is also extended to us as well. As he says in Revelation 3:21, if you'll overcome as I overcame, I'll grant you the right to sit on my throne just as I overcame and sat upon my Father's throne. So that invitation is also extended to us, if we'll just overcome. All right, I'm going to offer 8 points of Jesus' divine reinstatement throughout Hebrews chapter 1. This is kind of a very brief review. And in chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1, the Hebrew writer presents 8 points of divine reinstatement. This represents the reinstatement of all things that we saw Jesus surrender in Philippians chapter 2. If you'll remember Philippians chapter 2, there we saw Jesus surrendering everything as he begins his earthly ministry. So Philippians chapter 2 sees Jesus from the standpoint of the incarnation. Hebrews chapter 1 presents him from the standpoint of the resurrection and ascension. So what we have in these two different passages are two sides of the same coin. Whatever Jesus surrendered, whatever he laid down in Philippians chapter 2 is what we're going to see him take up in Hebrews chapter 1. He takes up the right of divine possession. So divine right of possession is his because now he is appointed heir of all things. What does he say in Philippians chapter 2? He had to surrender all things. Ownership of all things is now passed to him. He's now not only heir because of his right of creation, because he created all things, but also now by right of redemption because he has redeemed all things. He's purchased us back. Also, divine equality is restored because now he is the exact representation of his nature. What did he surrender in Philippians 2? He poured out of himself his form of divine equality. Now in Hebrews 1, he is again the exact representation of the divine nature. Verse 3. So the equality of which he emptied himself in Philippians 2 is the same equality that's expressed by the Hebrew writer as representing God. This includes intrinsic attributes as well as moral character. So not only are the limitations of the natural world that were imposed upon his flesh lifted, but now his moral character is no longer subject to vulnerability. He's overcome. Divine dignity is restored. Sit thou at my right hand. Divine preeminence is restored. Today have I begotten thee. Divine privilege is restored. Let all the angels of God worship him. Divine sovereignty is restored. Thy God hath anointed thee with the oil of gladness above your companions. What an interesting chapter. Does anyone have any questions over chapter 1? That's probably a pretty big question considering all the things we covered in chapter 1. We'll pick up in chapter 2 beginning next week.